Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Criminal Justice Natters with me, Ed Johnston. Today, we are joined by James Doleman, who is a journalist for the Byline Times newspaper. And we are going to briefly discuss the Daniel Morgan case and the subsequent independent panel report that came out last week concerning the case. We're going to cover police corruption, lies, cover-ups, and perhaps political influences as well. The interview is quite short, but I think we get to the point of what we're covering very quickly. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, James. Thanks for joining us this evening. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
And I was just wondering for our viewers, if you could just introduce yourself and tell our viewers what you do.
I'm a reporter. I mainly do court reporting, mostly for various outlets, but mostly these days Byline Times.
Okay, thank you, James. So what I wanted to talk to you about, how I discovered you, I read your piece concerning the Daniel Morgan case. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering, before we get into the questions, if you could give a timeline of events for people who may not be familiar with the case. I know it's spanned sort of over 3 decades. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, the case comes from an event, which was 1987. Daniel Morgan, who was a private investigator, who was a partner in a firm called Southern Investigations, was murdered in a pub car park in South London. He was killed with an axe. So that was the beginning of the case, a very notorious murder. Yet, despite 3 trials, 4 police investigations, no one has ever been brought to justice over it.
Okay. And why was Daniel murdered?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The main theory, and again, I'm going to be careful what I say. A lot of this stuff, these people are quite litigious. Mm-hmm. Was that Mr. Morgan had uncovered extensive corruption in the South London drug squad in the Metropolitan Police, and was about to go public with this story. So then he was silenced. That's the main theory of what happened.
Okay.
But also, well, there's another element that comes into it, which is about Southern Investigations itself. But the general assumption is certainly the men who were put in trial originally for the case, one of them was one of the police officers who investigated the case. So the links between the police and the murder and the subsequent cover-up are where the institutional corruption, as the independent report put it, come from.
Yeah, and that line, institutional corruption, I mean, that's a pretty significant claim to sort of level against the Metropolitan Police. It's almost as if that's as big as the Macpherson's institutional racism from back in 1999.
I think so, and it's a very bold statement from the inquiry, because, as always in any investigation, it becomes a few bad apples, the odd person that we've rooted out. But in this case, the committee concluded there was far more to this than that.
And in terms of being far more to this, can you explain maybe what some of that stuff was, those links?
I think when the case first came to, for myself, I'm mostly interested in and was interested in press misconduct. That's the area of interest that I had and why I got interested in this case. I don't do a lot of murders and things generally. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting was, well, one of the detectives, the person I interviewed for, you saw the article, David Cook, he was brought in from outside to investigate, do a second investigation on the Daniel Morgan murder. To give you an idea of the corruption, the man who led the first investigation at the Daniel Morgan murder left the police and joined Southern Investigations as the new partner of Daniel Morgan, which is quite shocking. Now, what happened with Mr. Cook was he noticed he was being followed. There was a van of people following him. His wife noticed that there was information being published that couldn't have been published. It was all very strange. They assumed because he was involved in this investigation that maybe a drug squad were after him, or a drug gang, or somebody. So they finally raided the van. There was a van that was following him around, and inside were 3 News of the World journalists.
Right.
So suddenly you've got to ask the question, which was asked of Rebecca Brooks by the police, why are your reporters investigating a detective who's leading a murder investigation? Especially as we know Southern Investigations had huge links with the News of the World. They were one of their major customers. What's your interest in this? And it's quite comical, actually. Rebecca Brooks said that they were spying on David Cook because they thought he may be having an affair with the police officer on Crime Watch. To which I was replied, well, they've actually been married for 7 years and have 3 children. So you think a basic journalistic investigation would have sussed that one out quite quickly.
Yeah.
So that to me is the overarching question. Why did the News of the World investigate police officers who were investigating a murder of someone who was linked to them? What was their motive?
Mm. And did the independent panel come to any conclusions regarding that motive?
They commented that it was suspicious, but they didn't make any finding of fact on it and made no criticism of it. News International, as was at the time, or Miss Brooks. They just laid out the facts on that one.
Okay. And in terms, you said the first police officer joined Southern Investigations. That was Daniel's investigative business, wasn't it?
That's correct. It was a guy called Philligy. He did the first investigation, which was slammed by the report. There was no forensics done properly. The scene was never cleared off. Leads were never followed up. And Philligy himself ended up charged with conspiracy to murder, though the case was dismissed at the Old Bailey. So, there's the nexus between police corruption, media corruption. These are all things that Leveson 2 was meant to look at. Look at. And because that's never happened, none of that stuff's ever been legally looked at until this report came out.
So we have corruption of the police, potential corruption of the media as well. Is this a case of a few bad apples? The head of the Met earlier said that, she didn't agree with this institutional corruption idea and trying to paint it as a few bad apples. Sounds like it's more than that.
Well, I think that because we've got to remember that the obstruction continued. I mean, this isn't something that happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The inquiry only got access to certain computer records they wanted last year. One of the reasons the inquiry's taken so long. Then just before it's due to be published, Priti Patel steps in and demands that the Home Office have a power of redaction. So it's not something from the ancient history. This is a thing from a couple of months ago.
Yeah. And in terms of the Patel sort of intervention, she wanted to read the report before it was published and then, might have taken bits out if at all possible. But in terms of the Priti Patel intervention, do you think that there's political corruption here as well?
Well, it's a big step to make. But again, if we look at the whole history of the News of the World with phone hacking and stuff, it's amazing how often it was deployed for political reasons. That there was someone who they saw as an enemy they wanted to destroy, far more than for reasons just to sell newspapers. Yeah. So it's very difficult. We know Rupert Murdoch. We know his influence in British politics. We know Rebecca Brooks, her influence in British politics. It's very difficult to assume they don't have any influence over Priti Patel. Yeah. But then again, it's very difficult because the report, while bad for them, isn't that damning. It doesn't draw any conclusions about their actions to a criminal standard.
No. And you say that this is, we've been discussing that this is, 30 odd years old. When I read the Byline Times over the weekend, I read Jake Arnott's article, and he sort of talked about the Dirty Squad were accepting bribes as way back as the 70s about sort of pornography and things like that. So this isn't a new issue, this police corruption idea.
No, it's not every generation police officers. They have a few arrests. We've fixed it. This problem will never arise again. And then a few years later, oh, look, here we go again. Yeah. But I was told by a very senior police officer in London that when they were doing drug busts, they didn't even bother with South London because as soon as they decided to do a drug bust in South London, they knew that would be leaked by corrupt officers to the drug dealers. So eventually they just gave up on South London. And this is in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. They just gave up. They went, there's no point.
And I thought the whole story concerning, or the whole account of what happened to Daniel, sort of started getting murkier when you read about the Freemason involvement and the Freemason involvement in the police force as well. And obviously, this has been well covered by the Line of Duty TV show. I mean, it just seems to get darker and darker at every single avenue here.
Well, again, it's not something I have any direct knowledge of. Understandably, it's a secret society. They don't publish a newsletter of what we did this week. No. But a number of people very high up in the case allege that Freemason involvement is very, very important. But I have to say I've no direct knowledge of it myself.
No. Okay. Kenneth Noy's name came up in some of the articles I read this weekend. Does he have a role anywhere in this? Was he ever caught for anything, or was he one of the people that was ever charged?
I don't think he was ever charged. He may be involved around the edges, but
yeah. Okay.
Again, I'm being very careful legally.
Of course, no, I absolutely understand that. It's just a question that sort of came to me yesterday after I saw something with his name in. So the Met's reputation is going to be very tarnished by this. I know that not necessarily the report was as damning for the politicians and maybe the media as it could have been, but how are the Met going to regain public trust or public confidence?
I think a lot depends. I mean, what's been fantastic about this case, the one, if we want to pull a ray of brightness out of it, despite all of the police, the government, the media, all that cover up, the courage and strength of Alistair Morgan's family, and especially Alistair Morgan, Daniel's brother, and people like Peter Jukes and Byline Times are pushing the case, did triumph over all that. Some of the truth came out. Now, it doesn't mean that there's going to be prosecutions or anyone put in jail. It's far too long for that. But at least now the truth has come out. What impact that will have in the longer term, we will have to wait until the longer term to find that out.
Yeah, and that was my next question about the idea that will Daniel Morgan's family ever receive justice? That, in your opinion, that's going to be quite unlikely.
Well, I spoke to Alistair Morgan, Daniel's brother, about it, and he was very pleased that he went through years of being called a conspiracy theorist, being dismissed, being thrown away from newsroom doors. Well, interested, it's an old case, but he stuck at it. And he said he was very pleased with the result. He said his one regret that his mother, who was also on the campaign, died before this report came out. So some justice has been done, but as you know, justice as a whole generally isn't always done.
No, and that's the very sad thing about this, that the actual culprits may not actually ever face any form of justice outside of something like this report coming out.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, James. That was extremely interesting. That was all of my questions. Did you have anything that you'd like to add about the case or what happened in the past couple of weeks?
No, I think your questions have covered most of the bases. It's been an interesting few weeks. And as I said, to me, it's the positive side of the story, that now, because people stuck to it and didn't take no for an answer, the truth's coming out. And that's, I think, a lesson for all of us.
Absolutely. That's a lovely way to end. Thank you very much for your time, James. That was fantastic.
No, it's great speaking to you, Ed.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
I'd like to thank James for his time and his openness concerning the Morgan case and the subsequent report that came out last week. I think it was quite a hard-hitting interview in terms of what we covered. So thanks to James for that. I'd like to thank all our supporters of the show that help keep this going. I'd like to thank Joe Doherty, Donna Jenkins, Lucy Green, Claire Malone, Ian Robbins, Elise Goff, Michael Saw, Pad Ryan, and Wolf Ryan. Please join me next time where we will have another very interesting guest. Thank you.